Hey, Dina, how's it going? Thanks for
Great.
joining the right mindset today. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me, Thomas. I'm very excited.
Yeah. We met through TikTok, and
Hmm.
I've been watching your adventure as an author. And I say author because you are writing books, and that makes you an author, in my opinion. And you're Dina VanCura, for
Hmm.
anyone listening on the audio side. You can find her on Goodreads and other avenues through DM VanCura. So it's just the letter D, the letter M, and then VanCura, VanCura. Now, I'm going to throw it right at you. I'm going to get the interview going strong. I'm going to ask you a provocative question on the industry of the publishing world. So here it goes. Can you name one experience you've had reading a novel that made you rethink either your interest in being a writer or refueling your desire to pursue a career as an author?
Ooh, okay. I definitely find that when I'm reading anything that has great world building, it really does reinforce like I want to create a world. I would like to know the ins and outs of it. I want to know what makes it fall, what makes it rise, who the enemies are. I think when I see some really great world building in a book, it happens a lot in fantasy and sci-fi for me because that's
Yeah.
mainly what I read. Right, writers are typically readers as well. That gets me fueled. I that goes for me.
Yeah, and it's like one of those the things about like fantasy and sci-fi, as you're saying, is they're so huge, these worlds. Whereas like a romance novel, and it's nothing to knock a romance novel, but they're usually more intimate for obvious reasons.
Hmm.
It's a
Yes.
small world. But when you think fantasy, even like a small fantasy novel, there's just so much world building in conversation. Two
Yes.
characters that just be like, "Yeah, I was over in the city of blank, blank, blank," which, by the way, I'm going to name a city blank, blank, blank now.
Nice. Mhm.
Now, when you're being inspired by these worlds, where you're just like, oh, do you feel you need to put that book down and get to work, or do you just keep reading and just let the world of your books fill up in your head while you're reading?
Okay, so I think it's a little bit of both. Sometimes if the world building's really heavy, I will stick with it because
Okay.
I try. I sometimes have a tendency to compare too much where I'm like, oh, my world building should be heavier or it should be more complex. And I'm like, let me just enjoy this. Let me just soak it in. And, because it's either audiobook or on paper that I'm really taking in this story. And I'm like, let me just stay in the complex world because I'm still building mine in my work in progress. Now, if I see a lot of adventure happening, or let's say I'm early in the series or early in the book and it's starting to
Mhm.
inspire me, I take notes and yeah, I will put it down. I'm like, I gotta write. I gotta do it right now. Let's set a timer. Let's take 20 minutes.
I got
Let's
I got to
write.
get to the book. I
Yes,
have to get to the
it
book.
does happen.
I don't want to forget this.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's fun when you're reading a book that is so thick with and rich with it, but it just gets you going. Now am I allowed to do this because it exists in this book? And it's like, but that's the fun part about being a writer. I try to tell people, especially when I work with them, it's like your plot has already been told. Like there's only 7 stories or something like that in the world, right? But the way you tell the story through your voice and through your eyes is always going to be unique.
Hmm.
So it's okay if you're inspired by, let's say, a Game of Thrones moment where you're like, oh, he spoiler alert, a character loses their hand. And it's okay if one of your characters loses a
Loses
hand
it.
defending the honor
Yes.
of somebody else. Do you read your book sometimes and go, oh, I think I know where this came from, and you realize it might be loosely touched on a book that you were reading?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I have to say then, yes. It happens when I read the Hunger Games trilogy
Okay.
a lot. And it's because I started writing mine thinking it was going to be a dystopian. And the more I wrote it and the more that I built out this world and really understood kind of the intricacies of it, I was like, it's really not a dystopian. It's fine. Like everything's okay. But at the very beginning, I talk about, or the story is reference to other areas in this city that are kind of in this dystopian like cycle, if you
Mm.
will, still and trying to rebuild. And I was like, pulling some of the Hunger Games references are back out of what I'm writing. I definitely will likely be thanking to Suzanne Collins for a little bit of like inspiration of like writing and like, you know, getting some going.
You're like, who's Candace? Why is she in this?
Right. Yes. You're like, where are these names from? It's like they're 4 syllables long or whatever it may be. I had to like rethink some of my names too because of my city and reading other stories. That's something else that I think that I pull from is the complexity or the origin of names.
Oh yeah, yep.
From other stories, and I'm like, okay, so I'm writing this sci-fi, so I have thought specifically about, well, what do sci-fi character names sound like? And for me, they're kind of strong with consonant and like normal simple vowels, and mine are like 1 syllable, 2 syllable names. But when I read a fantasy, it's like 4 or 5 syllable names, and I'm like, let's bring that back. Let's rethink these names a little bit.
Let's pull it in.
Yes.
And you know what I've always found fascinating about names is, and sometimes it's overwhelming, is you realize, wait, names can change from region to region. And then you're like, all right, if I'm writing a character, what region are they from? Mm-hmm. With their name, like, do you really think about that? Do you go deep into like, all right, this character comes from the quadrant of blank, 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 so I have to make sure their name fits this world? Or are you like, this character feels like a blank?
So it's a bit of both. So there are some characters. I have 2 generations of characters in my book. So we have some older generation characters. And with those names, I felt like they came from like cities off the West Coast. And I think of like people that I've met over on the West Coast in the US. But then I also think about people who actually may have names that are from the United Kingdom. Because I do think about people who may have settled in this area later after some sort of conflict has resolved. So there's a bit of a mix of names that clearly seem like older style or more established English traditional names. Mm-hmm. And then you have like these newer, younger sounding English traditional names. So
yeah, which makes sense because, you look at 30, 40 years ago, like the most famous name is, whatever, Ingrid.
Yeah,
right. Today it's like, Michael or, mm-hmm. Anna or something like that. I like my main character in my my whip is his name is Devious.
That's awesome. That's so cool. That's so great.
but it came up because the idea was I was creating the character as a hero, and he's like, he's loyal and trustworthy. He's like all these things, and I was like, it'd be so funny if his name was like Devious.
Right.
And then I was using it as a joke, and then I was like, it's such a good name. Like,
it's a good name. It works.
It really does. Except when you're doing like editing, the computer says, no, Devious, this is wrong. You're using it in the wrong context. You're like, no, it's a name. It's capitalized.
Right.
And so I found myself doing, like, I have a guy named Corgan Mosley. His last name's Mosley. Right. So like I found, because again, names are difficult.
Yes.
And it's just fun to kind of just take words out there and like filter them. Do you ever find yourself going to say like an Aztec like names or like Mayan names or Celtic names, and then just kind of changing a few of the letters or maybe combining 2 words to make a new name?
So at first I had a name. So my main character's name right now is Wren, like the bird. And there's a bit of a play on that. It used to be REN, which I hope anybody who contacts me can correct me if I'm wrong when I say this, but I had looked up the translation in Japanese and I believed it meant like lotus flower. And for some reason, like that really stuck with me of like this character may be seen as delicate on the outside, but maybe she's just like this lean, mean fighting machine.
Yeah.
But then the more that the story unfolded, it became WREN. Right. And changed the character's nickname and how people like poke at her a little bit with her name and everything, to call her Songbird. And she's like, stop calling me that. Which is kind of like a way for me to think about how my names have evolved. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of any other names in my book that have. I know that I do have an Aya, Aya, which also kind of has like a Welsh background. Again, kind of, coming from that region. But I haven't done much changing of like letters into it other than I would say Wren.
Yeah, yeah, but still, that's a strong, good name, like Ren,
Yeah.
Aya. Those are yeah, and I like how they're like basically one syllable, just boom.
Exactly. Very simple, punchy. I call them like punchy names. Like it's
Yeah.
just like a punchy name. Um, I also have, I was gonna mention there's a the evil character, the bad character. Her name is Onyx Roan. And
Oh,
Onyx Roan is Black Horse.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just like
Is
it's
she a
like
black horse?
she might as well be at this point. Like she's a force of nature. But I also thought of like when I grew up, I knew of the story of Black Beauty, and it's like when you see them, they're regal, they're strong, and it's like her character is those things, though she is devious
Yeah,
and all of these other elements to her, right? Because characters have depth and everything. But so I was
yeah.
going to mention that too, was like a little bit of meaning behind the name, not just like origin behind the name sometimes.
You have to add a little something. You can't just be like, "This is John,"
Right. Yes. Here's John. Here's
unless
Johnny.
he's garbage. He's the toilet. He's the toilet character. He's
Right.
John. But yeah, like the one of the female characters is a Zanaya.
Wow. Yeah.
So again, it's fantasy. So like you were saying, the
That's
names
great.
are like flowery and long.
Yes.
Zanaya, but then you get into the cities and the names have to change because these are barbarians and like nature people, and then the city people have like regular like Balin, like no one
Yeah.
cares. So I, as always, whenever I do these interviews, I like to kind of dig deep into sort of your career, your writing process, and the insight of the industry from your perspective. So let's start a little bit with your career, and not that. So what got you into writing? But um, can you kind of describe your career? Because the purpose of this show is to really shed light on the journey as a writer and to hopefully inspire others who may think it's much harder or much crazier in their head, even though it's hard. Every industry is difficult to get
Mhm.
into. But the goal is to say, look, even people in the beginning, the middle, or the end stages have a journey, and we like to look at it. So if you could kind of like talk us through your journey, your career as an author, and how you feel your career is going, and sort of like an introspective look into what you have accomplished thus far.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by saying I have a background in journalism and creative writing. So a lot of this started back in the early to mid 2000s, where I spent a lot of time really just trying to understand how to become and how to gain skills in like interviewing and getting into a small time newspaper, which is where, I ended up spending a lot of my internship time during college. So it was really around a very structured framework of writing and deadlines, and it was creative in the sense of, yes, you have a voice as a journalist, but very structured in the sense of you have an editor, you have a process, you have deadlines, and you have things that you need to get out, right? We had a beat. I was covering just basically town events. And then when I
Mm-hmm.
worked in my college newspaper, it was school events, things that happened on campus. So I had fun just like participating and kind of seeing what was happening around. So that's really what drove me to like continue to write, was like I always was looking for what was happening around town. And then I ended up finding out that the creative industry and advertising is a very difficult, very competitive place to be in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my writing went completely creative on my own, where I spent time like writing poetry at home. I've mentioned it on TikTok. I have such vivid dreams that I
Yeah.
will write them out. And those are out on for people to read too. I only have posted out 2 so far, that I have felt had good enough substance, right, to share.
Are those
Um,
two articles that you that are on your links? Yeah, I read those. Those
yes.
are really nice.
Yeah, those are 2 of the dreams I've had, right? And they're kind of rough, the way I wrote them. And this was what I was going to say too. Like in my process, I make a choice. Am I going to do a hard, clean edit, or am I just going to do a rough edit, make sure the concept's there, proofread it, and then provide that for people to read? And
Yeah.
I kind of separated those paths. So now I have 2 places that I basically spend writing. I have my hard edit path where I know what I'm writing is quote unquote good enough to edit,
Yeah.
and I need to be okay and forgiving in the sense of this is a process. It is not complete yet. And then I want the concept out there, and I'd like people to just kind of hear the story for what it may be.
Yeah.
Because likely what I'm writing, it's like it is what it is on that side. So those dreams are it is what it is, and then the other side is good enough to edit and good enough
Yeah,
to
and they're quick
work
reads too.
on.
I think one of
Yeah.
them definitely is 4 pages or
Yeah,
something like that.
exactly.
Yeah,
They're shorter.
Yeah, you don't have to like do like a 6-month edit on it.
Right. Yeah, I think both of them, I wrote them both, proofread them and everything in like 3 days. It was just a really quick, just clean it up, make sure it makes sense, pick the right POV.
Hmm.
I think one of them I wrote in third or second person, and then the first one I wrote, or the other one I wrote in first person.
Okay, let's kind of linger on that for a second, because second person, for anyone listening out there, is it's like immersing the reader into the character, and it's not a common
Mhm.
point of view. Third person limited, or is pretty consistent with like fantasy novels and stuff like that. First, what made you decide? And I'm guessing because it was a dream.
Yes. Well, for that one, I decided to keep it as the second person, as in imagine yourself in this situation. And
Okay.
as I kept with that, I just kept it consistent of like, you are this person who is going through this, and this is what's happening to you, and this is what you're viewing. And it could have easily been in third person
Yeah.
as well. I think that it kind of works either way. Like when you start to consider second person, you likely, at least for me, I would likely change it to third person.
Yeah.
But yeah, that one I left as second person. That's the first time I've written it as third person. Also, I think the way that I wrote that was also as because of me imagining myself telling someone in person.
Oh,
Like
I
I would
see.
say, imagine this, and I go, this is what your dream would be like. But then the other one was so close to home. Like the other dream came from it actually had closure. That's what was interesting. I don't know if dreams are an interesting thing. So I mean, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but we'll just blanket the statement of they're interesting. So in this interesting dream I had, it had closure. It's very rare for me. So I was like, I'm going to do this in first person. The fact that it has closure, let's keep this about me. So that's why that one ended up in first person.
Did you find it like first person and second person? The main difference is second person is you're really the narrator. You're the
Yes.
narrator.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first person, it's sort of like we're inside their head, but at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, there is a narrator. Uh, was that more of like a choice where you're like, let me challenge myself as a writer, or it just, like you were saying, it just felt so natural to kind of go second person and first person? Like, does the story dictate that, or is that something you put a little time into?
That's a great question. I know when I wrote those dream logs, if you will, it was pretty simple for me to stick with second person for the first one, and then first person for the second one. Now, for writing my sci-fi, that was a difficult choice, and I'm still wondering if it should be in third person, um, because of who the character is and how much is kind of happening for this character, and then
Mm-hmm.
all the other characters involved, because right, they all kind of have their own motivations and own reasons to exist and
Yeah.
kind of work through that story, the ones that are given significant roles. So that's still like a challenge for me. It's just really finding that balance of like, does it make sense to have it be all about, not all about this person, but all from this person's perspective? Am I going to miss anything significant if I stick with this one? And
Oh.
that's still an open question for me. Just I want to make sure. Maybe my editor can be like, stick with first person. You're doing fine. It's great.
Go back to first. Go back to
Yes,
first.
go back to first. You're doing great.
Do you ever find yourself saying, you know what, let me just take the first, maybe, you know, first chapter, for up to the first chapter break or the first chapter, and just kind of look at that in a different perspective or point of view, and just rewrite that chapter like in third person or first person? Or do you ever think of doing that?
I haven't done that yet, but that's a great point. I should do that. Even if I just do it with the prologue.
Yeah.
Like the prologue's like 3 pages. It's short. And I wrote it purposefully because I know I have no statistical evidence of this, but I've heard that many people skip right over it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write it short and sweet, and where it's like, if you don't read it, it's going to be fine. Continue. Because it's like, right, it is your story. When you read it, it becomes your story.
Yeah.
So that would be a great point. It's kind of writing that in third person and just getting some feedback on that.
Yeah, just the feel. Yeah, because
Yeah.
especially a
What's the
couple
feel
pages.
like? Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I like it this way. I like it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because a prologue's real purpose is to introduce information that isn't necessarily vital to the story, but adds value to it, so you can take it or leave it. I am coming from a fantasy with Dragonlance and all these other,
Yes.
I love a good prologue where,
Me too.
especially when it ends where you go, I kind of actually want to see that story, but in
Yes.
reality, you go, oh, and I like using prologues and epilogues, sort of like, this is the story before the story,
Hmm.
like with the world before this world existed. And then sort of like, this is what's coming
Yeah.
is like the epilogue, because I like to write series, So, but it's interesting that, like you say that, because there is a statistic out there that suggests that the majority of people will, because they come with bad, prologues, or, bad names comes to, like a
Yeah.
prologue. I
Right.
just want to get into the story.
That's exactly. I feel like that's what people are.
Yeah.
I would love for anybody to like reply or contact you and be like, no, that's totally not true, or be like, spot on.
Well, we should do a survey. We'll throw it up on the intranet. I hear
Yes.
it's a new thing going on. I
People
just
use
started
it.
getting used to those kids nowadays with their intranets. It's funny. I have a much, 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 much older brother, and he's still, to this day, whenever he gives you a website, he'll be like, "It's HTTP."
Oh, interesting. That's great. I'd be like, it's not secure. Where's the S?
We need that S.
We need that S.
What do you mean? Are they gonna break into my computer?
I love it when I talk to a developer and they say dub dub dub. I'm like, man, you are sophisticated. I'm like, I just say Google, like it's google.com. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're like dub dub dub. I'm like, I need to use that when I reference the
Well,
internet. Anyway.
one time I got you get those your car warranty things,
Oh, yes.
and they told me, I made like I was an old lady. I was like, oh, what do you mean I got it right? And they like, you got to go to the, we got to the point where they go to this website, and they say www dot whatever the website was, and I go, it's not working, and they go, spell out what you wrote, and I go www.dot. And then
Yes.
like no, not
Yes.
dot, like period, like a period, like the period. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, it's still not working. And they're like, spell out what you got. And I was like, www.pe.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic. I would be very similar. I will answer it like our local police department, and I'll say fraud department.
You've
That's
reached
just
the
how
fraud department.
fraud department. They're like,
Well, that was nice and casual.
yeah, very simple.
I am going to hang up on you now.
Yeah, or you answer that. How did you get this number? Like, real serious. So I play with it too. I feel like sometimes that's actually a fun way to like mess in with your own characters and kind of put them into situations. You're like, how would they act? I've only done it once, because like I mentioned, right, I have two generations in this story, and I have this is like not a spoiler, this is just preference of like the circumstance, the situation in the book is that the main character loses both her parents before the story even starts. Both her parents are gone.
That's traditional.
So right, so I'm like, it's pretty common to like have a main character who doesn't have the parents around, right?
Yeah, we don't want to hear bickering.
Yeah, so just keep the focus on her. But then the best friend of the dad is still around, and he is just this like, man, he just has a very short fuse. Like, it's just kind of like a fun curt character, and I'm like, sometimes I'll bring those traits into those conversations with like these random people who call me, the spam risk call, and I'm like, what do you want?
How'd you get my number? It's funny though, because like when you're writing, especially when you're heavy in dialogue, or you're not just the narrative scene, but like you're in a conversation, and then someone talks to you, you're still kind of in that character.
It happens, yeah.
Yeah, and like it's nice when they get to you when you're working on a fairly nice character versus the villain, where you're just like, what?
Yes, it is. Oh my gosh. Similar things happen when I read really strong characters. If I read a very lighthearted character or a funny character, I'm like, oh, and I'll think about and almost like pull that in and use it sometimes in dialogue. And it's funny how right, people don't typically notice that, but like my husband, he'll notice it. He'll be like, "You're not usually like." I don't have a good sense of humor. I like insult myself. That's like my sense of humor.
Yeah.
Or like sarcasm, right? Those are typically my 2 cents. And he's
Oh, so
like,
you speak 2 languages?
I'd speak to yes, I do. Fluently.
Fluently, I speak
Very good.
sarcasm.
I've spent
English.
14 years. Just kidding. But yeah, so like whenever I like write certain character traits come through, it's like he gets a little surprised by by it. And I'm like, oh, sorry. It's almost like I have to like tell him like I know I'm not this funny. Oh my gosh. It's funny how, yeah, I totally hear you on that though.
Yeah, the characters become, I mean, you have to.
Mhm.
Actually, that brings up an interesting question. Do you have characters, either currently or ever, where there's such, I don't want to say that they're like evil, but there's such a compound brain of just pure emotion wherever the spectrum takes them, that like it's exhausting to write them. Do you find
Mhm.
yourself doing that often?
It's actually a little exhausting to write my main character.
And why's that?
The reason is a couple of reasons. One, she's not very much like me, where like I have my heart on my sleeve. I'm very like I strive to be young at heart and just like not take things too seriously, because for a long time I did, and it's very stressful to live that way.
Mm-hmm.
But she does it. It's like it kind of reminds me of like who I used, like not who I used to be, but right the things that I would take too seriously, and she cuts people off a lot in the sense of like emotionally, and she hides her emotions a lot. And I'm like, that is it's exhausting for me to write about a character who constantly shields and blocks and pulls her emotions down and back and away. And when I'm writing that character, I have to almost like remind myself, like, let's take 15 minutes and write this. And then like I'll take a break and then I'll come back, because I will get really like it's dark sometimes when you have to think that emotionally. And then you're like, all right, now let's suppress all of these human characteristics. Just like bring it down. That's tough. But in the other side of that, like evil characters, I reference Onyx, this right, the evil character in the antagonist in my book a lot, but I don't really, she's not really in the scenes until like way later.
Yeah.
So I haven't had to like spend too much time recovering from writing her yet, which is nice.
Yeah,
but I will likely. But yeah.
You're gonna be like, oh Jesus. They're so dark, they're Onyx.
Yes.
I like that in stories though, where the villain, like Barbossa, the reason I think he has such an amazing entrance is it takes about 30 minutes before we see him, but everyone's talking about him, and then you see him and it's epic. And then he's so witty and he's so intelligent, and like there's just so many good qualities. So my favorite thing about villains, and I typically write these kind of villains, is where they're not evil. What they are doing is evil. Right? And I'm not saying like all people are their own heroes, but like in the sense they're philosophical in their choices. It just turns out what they're doing is they're going about it the wrong way.
Yes.
But they're smart, and well, some of them are dumb. But like,
yeah, some of them can be.
Some of them are dumb. But there's something more to them than just like,
yes, exactly. They're not there just to be evil, right?
Yeah.
Their motives come from a place of somewhere else. It's just like the bystander of that is people perceive them as, you're pretty evil, and you're like, I'm pretty deliberate and set in the way that I'm trying to accomplish this. But yes, the way I'm going about it isn't the nicest. Like it's just
yeah. And the other thing is like you have to keep in mind, the villain isn't very much on the streets with people, right? So the audience of your world also has a perception, which fuels the image of the quote unquote villain, even though it might be completely wrong. And then when you meet the villain, it's a nice twist, because it's the reader is like, oh, this is not who I was expecting, because it's been tainted by people that are, like the hearsay of the world.
Yep.
It's like, But yeah, now since we're kind of moving into the writing process, what is your general writing process from concept to say like finish?
So it is usually involves a lot of different like media or material in order to like document the concept in the first place. So sometimes I actually start with like little blurbs about the synopsis, or like actually something even shorter than the synopsis, right? It's just like gives me the punchy summary of like
Yeah.
what's the premise of the story. And actually I spend quite a bit of time with that, and I rethink that premise quite a bit. um I put a playlist together on like Spotify, and I'm like,
Okay.
what's the vibe of the story? Does that make sense? And then from there I usually build out, well, like who's the main character, and I usually start with characters. And then from there, so I've got my playlists, I've got my character list ish.
Hmm.
And then I have my relationships to character, like the relationships between characters. And I start to plot those out. I have 3x5. I still work with index cards, and I put them on the
Nice.
floor, and I'm like, this is the good side, this is the bad side. And like, here are the people who are on the fence in the middle, and like, whatever. The
Yeah.
world of like innocent bystanders assume after that. And then from there, I talk to people a lot. I'm like, what do you think of this idea?
Oh
Because like
yeah.
I've heard some people in their writing process, they don't like to share their work in progress.
Mm.
I am the opposite. I'm like, I'm telling everybody, because the more I tell people, the more accountable I become for my own
Oh,
idea and follow through.
yeah.
Especially if I start to hear like, oh, that's interesting. If I get good, right, positive feedback of interest,
Hmm.
that's usually what keeps me going. If I get like everybody going, I don't know, I go, great, I'm going to rethink this. This makes sense, because at first I thought I was writing things for myself, and I am, right. I'm writing for the joy of writing,
Yeah.
but I'm also writing with the goal of I would like someone close to me, my friends, my family, or even somebody on TikTok like Thomas to read my book at some point in the future, right? So feedback early on was really important to me too.
Hmm.
And then from there, I outline.
Oh yes.
So I have an outline, and it is at first it gets a little too detailed. And I'm like, you don't need to talk about how they feel. You just need to talk about what the chain of events is.
Yeah.
So
The
that's
plot.
usually right, exactly. Like get me through the plot.
Yeah.
Sometimes I try to write in there as well. And I do this a lot in Google Docs. So I
Oh,
know
yep.
some
Yep.
people use like Scrivener or other tools. Right now, I just work in Google Docs.
Yeah. It's very
And
concise in Google Docs. Yeah.
it is also, I really like I have a toddler. So like if I'm right, if our days are somewhat unpredictable, and let's say I'm up at 3 a.m. and I'm in
Yeah.
her room, I can be on my phone and I'm taking notes as something, thinking about something, and she's like just slumped on me. I'm just like on my phone, like she's sleeping. I'm happy. This is fine. Like everything's fine. So yeah, so it's just a lot of working through that plot. And then one day I just set a timer and I take 20 minutes and I write
Nice.
something. I don't even I and at first it doesn't have to be in the first chapter. It's just give me a part of that outline that I can work on,
Hmm.
to give it substance and see if it makes sense to me.
Oh, you don't
Even
write linear?
sometimes I won't like write linear. I'll
Oh,
write
nice.
like if something's troubling me. I
Hmm.
had recently something trouble me I'm in chapter 17 right now, but chapter 15 was troubling. I was like, this isn't working. I highlighted the whole paragraph and I was like, fix this. And I just kept going. I was like, because the outline, if my outlines has served pretty well as
Yeah.
guardrails to keep me going. So as long as I can get to like the next chapter, and that's usually what I did, and then I'll go back, fill that in, and then I'll fix and kind of make sure that
Yeah.
it blends well into it.
If we could pause there for a second, so, just for the audience listening, the technique that Dina's talking about, I know there's a lot of pantsers out there, and there's nothing wrong with pantsing, but the value of an outline is just that. Instead of being stuck on a part, and then you're like, I can't really go any further, you have that freedom to move forward because the outline is the plot.
Yes.
So you can kind of discover that. And what's nice is it's only your first draft anyway. So while
Yeah.
you're going back through, you could clean up anything as you're going. So it's really nice that you give yourself that freedom to sort of say, you know what, I'm just going to keep going. And you kind of highlight. When you highlight, do you also I use Coda, like I'll put like a symbol or like a word phrase, or like I have different like I'll write like grammar, because I feel like the grammar is really weird in that. And then I could just hit grammar and it'll just take me to all the grammar parts that I'm a little uncomfortable with, or whatever. Like, or like if I have to, name a character, I'll put like character 2, and then like it'll
Great.
just, and then I could kind of like find them. Are you someone who does that as well while you're handling your outline or your first run through?
I do. I use colors.
Oh,
So a lot of times, right, I don't use like that stark black. I have like the gray off of black.
right.
And if something's written in stark black, it's usually because I'm like, this is solid. Like, I don't want to change it. And then if I have like everything in gray, I'm like, I'm flexible. Now I have pink and blue in there too. And I'm remembering that I had pink as in like, this was something that like, this has to do with feedback. I need to look at this from feedback. So I'll highlight the whole paragraph. It may just be like one sentence and I'm like, let's look at the whole paragraph, or let's look at the whole page. I want to see what was written before and after. And then blue is general rework. Like just know you're going to spend time here rewording this or rethinking something. And then I have a lot of comments that just say fact check. Because I have a lot of like techno babble, but it's the future of, it's like near distant future of the US. I'm like, some things need to be kind of like, I can't just be like, oh, Los Angeles, blah, 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 founded in, it's like, get that right. Like that's the history. So there's a lot of points of fact check.
Yeah, it's historical fiction, as they call it, right?
Yeah, these are real, like the city, it's like it's not Gotham City, but it's like a Gotham City. It doesn't really exist, but it feels like New York, or it feels like a mix of New York and Boston, or so it's like that. It's actually a mix of St. Louis and Detroit. It's kind of what I'm doing for mine. Yeah. Right. So because of that, though, if I reference the Mississippi River, most of St. Louis is on the west side of the river. So it's like, I would want that to be as it is in the story, to be factual.
Yeah. And so you need people saying the song, the ISSIPPI.
Right now it's just called River. And I'm like, I need to name this river. This should probably just be the Mississippi.
The river. Did you see how big the river was? Yes, it definitely needs a name, right? All right, so that's interesting that you do the color code. All right, so you have your outline, and you do like a general plot outline where, like you're saying, it's just bullet pointed out ultimately. And what's the step after that? What do you do from there?
So a lot of times after that, I actually think about the feeling of the scene and then setting of the scene. So I think about if this is like, what are those feelings so that I can work with the dialogue. So if ultimately I want someone to potentially laugh, or I would like to like pull that from the reader of this is supposed to be lighthearted, I'll kind of like put that in there as a note of like, these characters are bantering. Or these characters are arguing, like they're not happy with each other. And I'll put like, there's a conflict here in character, or a big event happens here, and I'll kind of have that be a point. I know
inciting incident.
Yes, inciting incident. I know. I call it like kickoff, right? This is the kickoff. This is the thing that's going to catapult everybody. So that's the next piece. And then after that, I do a lot of reading because to start writing this was, like I mentioned, I wrote, I think it was like a page and a half, and it's not even in the, like, I ended up just taking it out. I was like, it just doesn't work yet for where and what this story is. It may never go back in, but it got me started in writing some part of the book. But then that chapter 1, it wasn't until I read Artemis by Andy Weir. Like the way that he started writing that book and having Jazz, the main character in that book, and just kind of being like put into this world, and the world is the moon, right? So putting on the moon, and she's like bounding like over the surface. And I just liked how he didn't question the intelligence of the reader. He was just like, it's the moon. She's in a spacesuit. She's bounding. Like, and that's what I did. I like, right when I was like, it can be simple, I just like started it. I was like, she's at work. People are buzzing her and she's annoyed. Like, just go. So really it was just kind of like, right. I would have people say ripping the Band-Aid off and just going for it at that point.
Who's notorious for that, believe it or not? George Lucas. Even though the sand is coarse and I don't like sand, he was one of the first to say, why do I need to explain what they're doing with the droids? Why do I need to explain that? Like, the
Yeah.
audience is smart enough to understand the book, you know, and you may not like his writing, you may not like his movies and so, but he did like he was also the first to do Dirty. Like before him, movies
Oh,
didn't have broken down filth, and it was in the future, and it was things wouldn't work, and you have to hit the
yep.
Millennium Falcon, or sorry, the aluminum Falcon.
Yes.
What's an aluminum Falcon?
Mhm.
So, so yeah, but you're right. You know, the audience,
Mhm.
you have to write for like a dumb audience, but not dumb it down.
That's a great point. Like, keep it simple. Like,
Mhm.
keep the scene kind of when you get into it, keep it simple. That was the biggest thing for me too. Starting with this, I like she works at a junkyard. So like
Yeah.
her place, it like where she works, it's just grime. But the junkyard is of autonomous vehicles. So
Oh,
it's like, right? Because it's future state. These
yeah.
vehicles are going to break down at some point. And it's like I spent many years in the auto industry. So it's
Hmm.
like I'm kind of taking that insight and that know all of like everything breaks, it's a car, of
Yeah.
course it's going to break down. And I was like, let's have her work in a junkyard. This is kind of interesting. It's the same thought of like, right, there's piles of old cars, but now there's piles of like new cars.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hear you. I think that's so it's really fun to like write about things that break. Like you're like, this thing isn't even like, it's going to be a fleet vehicle. It's not going to be like everybody's going to own an autonomous vehicle. And I mentioned that too in the story about like how much they may cost or how much like a gallon of gasoline costs in the
Yeah.
future. And you're like trying to find like a gas station. It's just, yeah, I think it's a lot of fun.
That's interesting. So in your future dystopia, there's still
Mhm.
gas. Like they haven't even worked. Maybe that's why it's dystopia.
There, yeah. So they can find gas, but I mentioned at some point, and this is again,
No
there's like no
spoilers.
spoilers here, right? Because it's a work in progress. It may not even be in it by the time readers read it.
That's
But
right.
there's a point that I mentioned where someone spends a quarter of their yearly salary buying a tank of gas.
Oh wow.
But like not like a
So it's New
20-gallon
Jersey.
tank, but it's like yeah. Or like I'm in Michigan, it's quite expensive here. But I like did the math and kind of just forecasted or like, projected what it could be. And I was like, that's about 15K. I was like, let's say this person, right, makes this much.
Hmm.
And I was like, and they want 1,000-gallon tank that they have to go to and fill up from. I was like, they're filling up that tank, this massive
Yeah.
reservoir tank. Because like you can't just go to a gas station anymore. You have to have your own reservoir at your house. Like it's
Oh,
just
okay.
like this crazy process of like, if you want to drive a gas, you got to work at it. Like,
Yeah. Like you got to build a tank.
yeah,
Yeah.
so that's what I was thinking was like, what would that be like? And I didn't mention it in my process. I do a lot of interviewing.
Oh.
So I've actually talked with people who are active military right now.
Hmm.
I've talked with, I have a couple friends who are cops. I plan on going to the junkyard that's like 10 minutes down the road. And I'm like, hey, picture this place in, 2071.
Yeah.
What's it like? They're like, I can't wait for them to all look at me like, what?
Think of
What
like
you
you need a
saying?
magnet.
Yes, exactly. So that is a part of my process too, is really talking to people. I can definitely search things on the internet
Yeah.
all I want, but I would like to hear from anybody in the perspective of the Midwest, since it's set in the Midwest, what
Yeah.
they think it's going to be like. As funny as it sounds, it's like, is rust going to be that much of an issue? We have a lot of aluminum alloy body vehicles now.
And it depends how
Um,
close you're out to the ocean because salt,
exactly.
like
Yep.
yeah.
Salt. Yeah, salt is insane here in Michigan. Like, I think that our snowplow trucks treat it as a sport. They're just like, how much can I put out? And but it's fun though to think about how I can go and I can interview these people. So that is a part of my
Yeah.
process too, is kind of really noting like this isn't complete until I talk to like a front end developer, a software engineer, a cybersecurity specialist, like that as well. Since there's not a little bit, there's quite a bit of data and technology referenced in the story as well.
Yeah,
So
because there is a
that's
big
part of it.
difference between knowing and understanding, and the more research you do, and the more people you talk to, and even if it's their perspective of like the junkyard, if you talk to several people, you're gonna start understanding it. And I think that to bring it to what's that age old thing, write what you know, not what right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Yeah,
like
right.
you're allowed to write outside of what you know as long as you do the work.
Yes, doing the work I think is half the fun too. I remember I follow so many of writers and authors on TikTok. I really have appreciated the community that I have connected to through that
Mm,
platform. I'll just say that.
yeah.
And someone didn't mention if you aren't researching, you are missing half the fun.
Yeah.
Like just getting to know the detail and kind of taking it and figuring out what makes sense for me to have in my story. That's been a lot of fun in my process too.
Yeah, I've learned 70 different ways to say the word poop, so
My child is saying hi to me. I was like, what is happening behind me?
am I haunted?
But yeah, that's actually a really good point. Just learning how to, learning new words or actually coming up with new words. Like I said,
Yes.
like technobabble has been an interesting thing that I've been having fun with.
Yeah.
And I thought of it from Star Trek perspective to give you an
Oh,
idea of
okay. What's that? What's
that.
Star Trek? No, just
Oh
kidding.
yeah, right. Wait a second.
What is it?
It's the other.
Is that the Orville? No. Great show. Speaking of name word changes and stuff like that, like it's so easy to just be like, this is a general, a colonel, a sergeant, a lieutenant. This. Do you find yourself just you're writing more historical fantasy
So
or sci-fi historical fight?
I'm writing. So it's future, but there's definitely like there's an accurate history
Yeah.
to yes.
Yeah, because there's an LA, so you can't just be like LA is made up of Mogul.
Exactly. It's yes, there's definitely very much like Detroit is the place where like everybody says like the assembly line, right? It's the automotive world or whatever. So like yes, there are these references of from real
real
from
things.
our real thing.
But
Yes.
you also have the advantage of it being the future, so like you could technically change titles, rank, terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you do so your book kind of stands out? And do you consciously go, am I going too far from the original word where do I have to kind of explain it to somebody, or should I just, again, like you said, I'm just going to throw them in there. She's on the moon. She's working. Like, do I really need to explain that this is a different term for a general?
That's such a great question because I did struggle with this a little bit. So the reason I struggled with this was because at first I thought, how complicated, but how simple can I make it where I have my own ranking? Because there is in this company, Ganymede Security, there's security officers, and I was like, oh, I could have them be like star level 3 security, and I was like, why can't they just be a sergeant? Like it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, let's just start with that. Like if I understand enough about, let's just use like the Army military ranking,
Mm-hmm.
and then talk with Army or military personnel to say, this is my goal with this ranking of security officers, and kind of just get that feedback from them. That's actually what I did. So I've just worked with like a sergeant instead. And yes, I totally hear you on, because like, but I also have thought about how a sergeant, like what their badges look like or their stripes look like, that would be very unique. So if I were to describe that, right, it would be like their way of displaying and signifying their level would be right unique to their position.
Yeah, because even in Star Trek, I think they use mostly Navy because that's right.
Yes.
So, but because it's Admiral, like even like the way they represent it with the circles on their neck, like that's different than but they're still like someone's an admiral, someone's a captain.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, that's yeah. I like I call like the lowest ranking soldiers in the Maven army, which is Maven's the main bad guy, but I call them Prima, right? But like they might be considered privates, and it's interesting because like you read certain books, like when you read Brandon Sanderson, he's not like this is a a New York state trooper,
Right.
it's like it's their own police and stuff like that. One of the things that I like, my father was in Vietnam and everything, so his biggest gripe when he used to watch like like military films, or the person used to be in the military, whatever, is that like certain ranks are not field operatives.
Yes. Yes, I know that. So my dad was in the Air Force for 23 years.
Yeah.
So it's like, and so it always bothered him when enlisted versus officer got mixed up. He was like, not possible, like in stories. And I'm like, thank you for that. So like, that's something else I think about too, is like, she was an officer. She may have friends that were enlisted. So, right. Just like even that distinction and how that ranking works can frustrate people.
Yeah, because you can join as an officer if you go through a certain school, like not Neopala or Neopala. What is it? Neopala, whatever. The
I
Navy. The
see.
Navy, right?
Like I know of ROTC for the Army.
Okay, all
So
right.
like, but to your point, yes, like
Yeah.
that, yes, that is the point. There are prerequisites, there are standards, and there are tests, and there's education, and there's all of these things that you need to ultimately pass and be accepted into officer ranking. Like you
Yeah.
can't just like walk in like, all right, I'm
You're like,
ready.
I'm an officer. You can call yourself an officer all day, but go over there and clean the toilets.
Yeah. We all start somewhere.
Yeah, you have to, and uh, but it is funny when you're watching and like the first person through the door is like a lieutenant or something. You're just like, why are they having a gun out? Like their job is to order the field, not
Yes.
you know. But all right, so you do the outline, you do your research, you do your interviews, and then just to sum up the end, because I want to kind of get to your insight of the industry a little bit. Uh, do you basically, once you have your interview set up, you start your writing your first draft? And
Yep, and just go from there. So it's been pretty iterative. I have been working in I would say the first draft is kind of like my third draft. I've been just going through and working on these sections that are what I would say like ready for editing versus like I'm still
yeah.
kind of working through. I need to go back and have more rounds with interviews, just getting some feedback from people. I have 2 alpha readers, which is
Okay,
great.
good.
So I've already got them involved to read that prologue and the first chapter. And as I go, I more just provide them with my plans for editing. And I'm
Yeah.
like, this is what I think it will become. What do you think? And right, so that I can kind of get them in the process. So I said iterative, but also very waterfall. Like that's like a developer talk, but it's right. There are things that have started already for me, in the sense of getting that feedback, getting those interviews,
Mm-hmm.
kind of going in parallel as I continue to write. Like I'm not done with this because so I have my outline,
Mm-hmm.
but as you write it, you're like, ooh, I feel like now there's something missing.
Yeah, the
So then you have
discovery
to go
process.
right. So, but then I still go back to the outline and I go, okay, so what's missing in the outline? So that at least I can still use that as like my guardrails, my starting point for
Mm-hmm.
continuing to write these final chapters. Yeah, but it's very iterative. I just keep going with it.
Yeah, you gotta go a little here, go back, and also for anyone listening, for the audience, alpha readers are traditionally utilized for the technical elements of a story, and not necessarily experience. Whereas a beta reader is traditionally the experience of the reader, and like do they like it? Does it flow? Who do they like? Who do they not like? So it's often I see, especially baby authors, they just go beta reader. They don't realize,
Yeah.
oh no, you need an alpha reader before you even get to draft 3.
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
do you do a zero draft, by the way?
Explain to me a zero draft.
So yeah, there are several ways.
Okay.
My way I do a zero draft is actually after I do my outline, I go back and I bullet point out the scenes and
Okay.
I build out the scenes through beats. And that's technically my zero draft because I'm sort of just kind of working out the ideas.
Okay.
A traditional zero draft is written and it's just train of thought. And you could take your outline or no outline and just kind of see where the story goes, but it's not going to be the story you end up with. It's sort of like you're working out the scenes, you're working out the characters' voices. I like the other way because I already know my story, and then I want to plot out or beat out my scenes and develop like dialogue beats and character
Right.
movements. So that's usually what a zero draft is. It's the part right before you technically write right.
Okay.
You know.
I think that I may have skipped over the zero draft, but I've kind of used something differently where I've really just spent time with like character development of like, what does this
Yeah.
person sound like? So it's like, if they were to want to communicate this, they would say this, not that.
Mm.
So I kind of worked that out a bit. And then I put it into scenarios. So one of my Aya is actually, she's a robot.
Yeah.
So, and there's a certain way that I've defined her to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And there are so many perceptions of what an AI robot would sound like. So I had to define that very early on for myself of how does she speak when she's in this situation, or if she's being informative versus argumentative versus whatever it may be. Yeah. And then I've worked it into like a situation, but I feel like it hasn't been with chapters or with the outline. It's me
Yeah.
just thinking about developing what the dialogue would sound like. There are elements to it that
Yeah,
would
I
be from
mean,
a data
yeah,
drive for sure.
everyone has a different process.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, when you write an AI, though, are you allowed to write AI? And if so, are you allowed to use AI dialect? Because you are not AI.
Right. And I've always said like this is such an ironic. I think it's basically ironic is that like if you think about it, at some point if the book becomes a book, if it's
Yeah.
published, and I have an audiobook narrator read it, they'll be voicing an AI, and I'm like, that's ironic to me. Just like, so yeah, there's like this. It's just kind of funny to think about how characters come to me and you're like, all right, well, this is what they're going to sound like. And I have, so mentioning that though, in my process, I had one interview so far with a developer
Mhm.
about AI and what it means for the future. And it is it's such a tangible thing and developed thing that to bring it into the creative space has been an interesting conversation where I'm like, well, it's not real. The one that I'm writing, it's not real. Like
Yet.
it can do anything, right? It could be anything. And so that's been the most, not difficult, but most heavy and deep conversation about
Yeah.
like, well, what is AI in 50 years? And I was like, that's what I'm having fun writing. And then it's like, but it has to feel so factual and real, but
Mhm.
yet it's not. Those have been the most interesting interviews.
Does your AI survive by the 3 rules?
No, it does not. No, it does not. Which I feel like people would be like, what? And I'm like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think so. A little more Murderbot series, I would
Oh,
say.
yes. Very good. Very good
Yeah, like
series, yeah.
I'm gonna say very real sounding or very real
Yeah.
feeling.
So they
There
like watching
are
TV all day?
so one of them does. One of them is like one of them is basically like a night. I'm gonna call it like a night security guard.
Okay.
Apologies to anybody if that is offensive. But somebody who may just like to this point, you know what? It's very Murderbot. It's not night security guard.
Yeah.
It's like I want to sit down and I just want to watch my shows. Like, can you just call me when I'm on duty? Like that's when you should be contacting me.
Yeah. Murderbot's a great series, by the way, if anyone's
Fantastic,
listening.
yes.
And they're short books, right? They're like
Mhm.
pretty quick.
They're
The
very quick reads.
Yeah, they're not vanillas.
Oh no, novellas. Yes.
Novellas. They're basically
Yes, yes,
novellas.
yes, yes.
Vanillas. They're making a show, I hear. A
I did
Murderbot
not
show.
know that.
Yeah, I
That's
think
great to know.
if the last thing I read was true, I think they're writing it, and the author is involved, and she loves where it's going.
Awesome. Okay, great.
All right, so real quick before we get to the conclusion, I know we're trying to keep it tight here. Can you give us a little insight to the publishing industry from your perspective and how you see it? I'm specifically talking about traditional publishing, self-publishing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a negative area. But self-publishing is more an intimate process because anyone could do it in their own fashion. But as far as what you know and understand about traditional publishing, what is your insight to it, and what can you tell the audience sort of like from you?
So I view traditional publishing the same way as looking to find your dream job.
Okay.
There is a certain way that you view yourself and you're like putting out your skill set and you're putting out your experience and you're like, this is why you should trust me. This is why you should understand and kind of like reference, like, here are my references. Here is my background. Like you have all of these things that you have built up to really define why you should be there. And then you have like, here's my work. And they're like, now I get it. Like, I see your work. I see your background. I see that you have purpose. Like you have this, right? You have all of these qualities and traits. And that's kind of my way of viewing this traditional publishing world, is that my book is a product and
Mm-hmm.
I am the supplier of that product. So if I understand best what they're looking for in that product, the better I am at providing that to them. I also have this perspective that there are potential gaps in the marketplace right now, and my book may help fill that gap.
Okay.
And different publishers will find that appealing to them based on what they publish and what kind of is what they want to provide to people to fill that market need. So it's very, I view it as very objective. there are many conversations that make it deeper and kind of like pick
Yeah.
apart the traditional publishing industry. But since mine is so objective, I've stuck to a very objective view of them. And it's like, I have a product and we're going to see if they like it. And if they don't, then we're
Then
going
we'll
to
blow them up.
either we'll work on it and we'll come back to them and say, hey, I've heard your response, or I've heard your replies, and I've gotten your feedback, and like I've worked on it. But it's very much like, I'm like, this is a business relationship.
Yeah.
Let's see what we build out. Very similar to like how I've built and come into my career.
So if I'm to sum that up for the audience listening, basically you are Apple company, and your book is basically the iPod, because it's fulfilling a gap in the industry of portable music.
That's a perfect way to put it. Yep.
Yeah.
There is a need there, and you ultimately are bringing value to that.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. All right. So we're getting to the end. So I have to ask you the other question that you had picked at the beginning of the show. All right. Which is kind of interesting because it's sort of is related to what we were just talking about. From the outside in, the industry of traditional publishing is covered by misconceptions based on hearsay, limited research materials, and quote unquote experts that have continued to distort the system. How has what you've learned of the industry impacted your journey as an author?
It's so funny. It hasn't impacted me at all. Because it's like, to your point, or like that kind of like that lead into that question of like, if I have a question about what I just heard, I actually will go right to the source. And I'm like, I understand that they skew it right for their audience. But I do have a goal of being traditionally published.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it hasn't changed much. It hasn't changed much. But many of my friends and family are like, you can self-publish. I'm like, yes, I can. Like, that's great. And they're like, but you can traditionally publish. I'm like, yes, I can. And it's great. Like, I feel very good about either path. And it hasn't swayed me. What I've heard and what I've learned hasn't swayed me from.
Yeah, like the information hasn't been like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's good to.
Yeah, it's just good to know.
It's definitely good to know. It's also good to know the misconceptions. It's good to hear like what people think, so you can kind of like assimilate the information as needed and
form my own opinion, all that.
Yeah, but as you discover the truth, it's interesting to see what. And I'm not saying this in a negative way, but the bottom level sees. And it's like, well, how do they even know anything if they aren't even in that world? And then when you're in that world, you're like, wow, like I thought what they thought. Why did I think that? And because it just felt right that like, oh, I'm gonna get published and I'll be able to pay my bills for 6 years.
Yeah. I have the same perspective of any way that you publish is we're doing this with our passion, right? We are passion led. And that is regardless of if you go traditionally published or independent, published.
There's not a lot of money either way.
Project. Yes, I've said it to my friends as a joke, but I'm like, I wouldn't have been a writer if I wanted to make a lot of money. I would have been a doctor or like,
at
least in the US. Yes.
Well, when I was in the music, because that's where I started, I was in the music industry and everything. Like I used to tell people, I made more money working in the industry than I did with my music. Mm-hmm. And the reason is because there's no money in the music industry when it comes to music, but I would get hired to do like studio work, or I'd get hired to tour, or I get hired. Like I was in the industry. The same thing with writing. Like I'm in this industry as a writer. I get hired to help people with screenplays or novels or whatever. But like, even big name authors who were getting work as doing writing stuff, even just general copy, like marketing copy and stuff like that, their books weren't selling yet.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But they were still in that industry and they were still working. And some people like, no, I'm going to be a waitress or a waiter or server. And then if something happens, awesome. It's like, no, get in your field.
Yeah.
Work in your field as best you can, even if it's little things, because like you want to be known as somebody who writes, somebody who knows, so, but I do want to say, Dina VanCura, DM VanCura. I really appreciate you coming on and letting me sit down and have the honor of interviewing you and hearing about your journey. So thank you for that.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
It's been wonderful.
It's been a wonderful experience, and I appreciate that. I'll send you $20 later. Where can the I'm going to put your information in the description of the video, but again, this is audio as well. It goes on all the platforms. For those listening, where can they find you?
So they can find me, I would say, mainly on TikTok and Instagram, as well as Goodreads. So Goodreads is going to be if you want to see what I'm currently reading, of course.
Mhm.
And then TikTok is a little bit more about my writing journey. And then Instagram is a lot more about books that I'm reading and my reactions to those books. So all three of them, or no, so TikTok and Instagram is DM VanCura Writer. That is the handle. So, and then on Goodreads, I think I'm on there as DM DE or DIEM VanCura.
Yeah. Yeah, DIEM. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
DIEM. And like I said, if anyone wants to go back to the YouTube, if you're listening to this audio, you can find all information in the description below. All right. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everything. And obviously, you know, what do we always say on the do you know what we always say on the TikTok?
What do we always say on the TikTok?
What do I always say at the end of every video on the
I
TikTok?
watched so many videos of yours to the end, and I can like not remember. This is what happens when you're near vacation brain.
It's all good. It's all good. I'll do the sign off. You ready?
Yes.
All right. And as always, keep developing the right mindset.
Yes, keep developing the right. I knew that. Okay. Wonderful, wonderful.